This video is going to provide a pretty quick overview of the presidential election process. A lot of the stuff we've already talked about because obviously it's a presidential election year, but this kind of relates to the executive branch unit, so we're just going to go over it one more time. And you want to follow along and with the video and sort of record the notes on page 4 to 6 in your notes packet. So the first thing that happens, this happened before this year, so we didn't talk a whole lot about it, is the primary process in a presidential election. So if election day is in November, right, like November 2020, you had the presidential election. Starting the previous January through June, you have primary elections in every state. So it's the January and June through June prior to the November election. And the goal is to have an election in each state that narrows down like a party's field of candidates to like one person. So at one point, there were like 15 Democrats that wanted to run for president. And then each state had elections. And those elections and the results of those elections gradually narrowed that field of 15 down to one, Joe Biden. And the Republicans didn't have a primary because they had a president that wanted to run for re-election. That was obviously Donald Trump. But in a year when there's not a president seeking re-election, each party would have to have a primary process. So the goal was to narrow down a field so it's one for each party running against each other in November. 27 states have what's called a closed primary system, including Pennsylvania. This is when only registered party members can participate in their own party's primary. So only Democrats could vote in the Democratic primary, and only Republicans could vote in the Republican primary. States that have a closed primary system, independents can't vote, right? That's a negative. 22 states have what's called an open primary system. Voters can pick whatever primary they want to participate in, regardless of their political affiliation. So Democrats could vote in the Republican primary, and they wouldn't be able to vote in the Democratic primary. And Republicans could vote in their own primary, but then you couldn't vote in the Democratic primary. So you just pick a primary, regardless of your political affiliation, you vote in that party's primary. Independents can choose to participate in this process. And then Iowa is the only state that holds what's called a caucus. This is different. Instead of going into like an election booth by yourself, there are meetings held throughout like public facilities in Iowa, libraries, schools, gymnasiums, and party members actually sort of hold meetings to decide who their preferred candidates are. They do it out in the open, they argue with each other, and they try to sway each other to support like their preferred candidate. So that's a little bit of a different process because it's out in the open and it's public, compared to like the primary process that like Pennsylvania uses, which is like secret ballot. Like you just vote and nobody sees who you're voting for. A couple things to note. If you look at the graph, it only goes to 2014, but like the election results are pretty consistent. Less people vote in the primary elections than they do in the actual like November presidential election. And that's pretty consistent. And the consequences of that is that the people that in the parties that do tend to participate tend to be like the most passionate, extreme members of their party. Like moderates, a lot of times don't vote in the primaries; they wait until the general election in November. And when that creates a situation in which oftentimes the most extreme and diehard members of the party that participate in the primary are usually selecting the like most like extreme members of their party to run. And then by the time the rest of the party participates in November, a lot of people are unhappy with the candidate. So that's the negative of considerably fewer people voting in primary elections when you're actually narrowing down a party's field. After the primaries, each party holds a national convention, and this would generally be held in July or August prior to the November election. The Democrats will hold it in one city, the Republicans will hold it in another. It's usually over like 2 or 3 days. And the purpose is that each party officially introduces their candidate that like the primary process produced. They give a bunch of speeches. They announce their platforms. Platform is simply sort of announcing what the individual candidate that's running for president stands for, and then what the party overall stands for. It's like a glorified like pep rally. So that takes place in July and August prior to the November election. And then from September to November, you actually see like all the campaigning. So the primary process is actually longer than like the campaigns that the parties have against each other. This is where you see all the ads on TV. And you can see that the general trend with sort of like campaign spending is that each presidential election year over the last like four, more money has been spent, more and more and more money. And this is sort of the general trend that the parties are spending more trying to get their candidates elected. You can also see in 2020 that the Democrats spent considerably more than Republicans on their presidential election campaign. So you see that as well. And we're talking like billions and billions of dollars being spent. And also during this time period, you generally see two or three debates between the two candidates. And you kind of lived through that this year. And then in November, you eventually have like the general election, right? So this is stuff we've all talked about like during the course of this year. Obviously, the general election, you have like Trump versus Biden, or from previous elections, Trump versus Clinton, and then you generally know how the electoral college works. Each state has a number assigned to it. The number really represents the number of electors that will be chosen, that are chosen by each party. So in Pennsylvania, the number is 20. There are 20 Republican electors and there are 20 Democratic electors. And remember, these are the people that kind of have the final decision on who the state's going to support for president. A party's set of electors get to go to their state capital in December to cast the votes for president if their party gets the most popular votes in the state. So clearly in 2020, Biden got more popular votes than Trump. So the 20 Democratic electors went to Harrisburg in December and they casted their presidential electoral votes for Biden. And remember, each number you get by adding a state's senators, where everybody has two, regardless of the size of your state, to the number of representatives they have, which is based on a state's population. So that gets your electoral college number. You're just adding reps and senators together. And overall, you need 270 electoral votes to win the presidential election. And there are definitely some pros and cons, as we mentioned, to the electoral college system. Some of the pros are that it definitely gives the states a major say. Every state is involved in this process because each state has like a point total to it. So again, that's federalism. It keeps the states sort of relevant and powerful in the presidential election process. It forces candidates to campaign in areas besides the big cities. Pennsylvania's got a large population besides just Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And whoever wins the entire state gets all of the electoral votes for that state. So it's important that a president campaign all sorts of different areas, all sorts of different states as well. So it kind of forces them to campaign over a larger area. It definitely empowers minority groups, as we previously talked about. Some groups, minority groups, make up a larger percentage of the state population than the national population. So, for example, Hispanics make up a larger percentage of the population in Arizona than they do nationally. And Arizona has a lot of electoral votes. So a candidate might have to work harder to get the votes of those minority groups because they're critical to winning a particular state. And then it also sort of promotes stability because there's really only two parties that have a chance of winning the electoral college. And that's because it's winner take all. And it's really only the Democrats or Republicans that are going to get enough votes to win an entire state. So it's kind of easy to follow along with. It's either going to be a Democrat or Republican that pretty much wins every year. There's some pretty hefty cons, though, too. Sometimes the candidate with the most popular votes doesn't win. And this is obviously confusing to people. This has happened a handful of times in our country's history. In 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, 2016, 5 times in our country's history, the candidate that has won the most popular votes from the people hasn't won or didn't win the electoral college. Remember, it's the electoral college that really matters. And again, if you win big in a state that doesn't have a lot of electoral votes, but then narrowly lose a state that has a lot of electoral votes, you may have a situation where at the end of the day, you have more popular votes but less electoral votes. And that's sort of a tough explain for people to understand. You could feel bad for some of the states that have 3 electoral votes. That's the minimum you can have because everybody has 1 rep and everybody has at least 1 rep and everybody has 2 senators. But in many cases, those states don't even really deserve the 3 electoral votes because they get the automatic 2 because everybody gets 2 for their Senate positions. So it actually does give the small states a bit more power than they probably deserve. There's not a whole lot of like battleground states. You saw that in the election. Most states we generally know are going to either vote Democrat or Republican every single year. And then there's only like a handful, maybe like eight states that can go either way. And it seems like the candidates put all their focus in those states. And if you live in Texas, which tends to be a very Republican state, and you're a Democrat, it might make you want to not vote in the presidential election. Or if you're a Republican in California that almost always votes Democrat, kind of makes you not want to vote because like you're not contributing to a national total and you're going to sort of like have your voice drowned out within your own state. So it actually makes people not want to vote sometimes too. There is the potential for faithless electors, and these are electors that vote in a different way than like the state popular vote turned out. So for example, there are more than 20 states that don't have any kind of rules that force their electors to vote the way that the sort of like state indicated they wanted the electors to vote in the popular vote. So that can be a problem too and can be pretty confusing. No election's outcome has ever changed because of a handful of faithless electors. And generally, every election there's a couple faithless electors, but this again not enough to change the outcome of an election. And then the negative is sort of the opposite of the one over here, right? Is that third parties can't win. You could argue that one of the major problems with our system now is that there's only two options, Democrats and Republicans, and that maybe we could benefit from third parties. But third parties can't win presidential elections. They might be able to get some votes in a state, but they're not going to get the majority that's needed to win the electoral votes for the state. So that's sort of the negative. It's really going to prevent third parties from ever like having a chance to win like the electoral college. And then just a quick note, there are lots of alternatives out there to the electoral college. Like we could choose another way to select our president, even though we've used the electoral college from the beginning. It's clear that a majority of Americans now support getting rid of the electoral college and just changing to overall direct popular vote, which is whoever gets the most votes across the entire country, like you automatically win the presidential election. Like abolish the electoral college. And again, 58% of Americans now, that's pretty decisive, would like to amend the Constitution so that whoever gets the most votes across the country from the people just wins the presidential election. But despite the fact that a majority of Americans support that, it's probably not going to happen ever. Because remember, we talked about the amendment process. The states are the last part of the amendment process. They're the ones that ratify it. And right now, the states are like super relevant because of the point system in the presidential election process. And why would they change the setup to make themselves like less significant and less influential? So again, because the states are like part of the amendment process, an amendment would be needed to abolish the electoral college and switch to direct popular vote. It's likely that it's not likely that this is going to change, right, anytime soon, despite the fact that a majority of Americans really support moving away from this sort of very complicated, confusing presidential election system.